So, hi, Mariana. Thank you very much for taking the time out to join us today as you're landing back to Earth after your summer holiday. There are
Great to be here.
probably a bunch of people who are joining and hearing potentially you for the first time. I wondered if you could start off by just explaining your thesis about, I guess, the role of government and government-led innovation.
Sure. So, I sort of always start from the beginning, which is what do we know about the economy? And the economy, and I am an economist for all my faults, has not just a rate of growth, but a direction of growth. And really what I've been talking about is what do we know about that direction, how it's set, the problems that can also occur when it's set problematically, but especially when we don't talk about it. So this notion, for example, that government is simply there to fix market failures, which is the way that economists speak about the role of public policy. The idea that you have markets, sometimes they mess up and the government has to come in and fix the problems. That's a very problematic notion in terms of allowing that framework to then direct us towards building a better type of economy. So what I mean by that is an economy that's more inclusive, that's more sustainable, and that actually meets all sorts of different goals that we might have. So we have 17 big goals globally, these 17 sustainable development goals. Can we actually fix our way towards those goals? My answer is no. So what I've done in the past is, one of my books, The Entrepreneurial State, kind of just did a deep dive into one part of the world, Silicon Valley, which a lot of people talk about still today, in terms of what do we actually know led to that innovation-led growth that part of the world experienced. And the role of government there was not just fixing markets. There was actually lots of different public organizations. They were strategic. They were trying to solve huge problems, and they were distributed across the entire innovation chain. So that decentralized distribution of active public agencies, not just around basic research, but also applied research and patient long-term financing of the few companies that even want to innovate downstream, and then even further downstream, kind of strategic public procurement, right? So government as purchaser. And I kind of broke down that story and said, what can we learn from that? What can we learn from that? For example, if today we really want an ambitious green transition, a green deal, call it what you want, a green revolution, what kind of public actors do we need? So it's not just about public money, kind of helicopter money coming down, funding renewable energy. It's also about that organizational capacity, which unfortunately is often missing on the ground precisely because we haven't been learning the stories of kind of what works, what doesn't. And the irony is that whereas with the private sector, of course, we admit they create value because many private companies do create value. Then we've had really interesting conversations about the transformation of private sector organizations in order to be creative, to step out of the box, to be constantly rejuvenating their organizations so they don't get too bureaucratic and inertial. We haven't had that same level of discussion inside the public sector because we haven't admitted that it did anything more than just fix market failures. So I'll shut up in a minute. The reason I then kind of went out of my way and set up a whole department at University College London around these themes is I really deeply believe that the question is not just about better policy. We actually need new thinking. We need new tools. We need to redesign the tools of public policy. And we need a new curriculum to be helping civil servants globally do that, when we admit that value is co-created by both public, private, third sector organizations. But the state bit of that has been kind of too clunky and very problematic.
Thanks. I mean, and it seems like there's something quite deep and quite simple here in that thesis that if government is just there to correct the market, who actually is setting the direction, right? Because if the government isn't doing it, what does that mean? It's just the private sector, it's technology trends. There isn't anyone necessarily setting a direction, right? And we're here, I guess, and you've spoken at the past summits around, we're all about circular economy and that offering a vision, an alternative vision, a direction in some ways. What intrigues you about the circular economy concept, and how do you see that relating to the role of government?
Okay, so first of all, this issue about directionality isn't a normative point. It's just kind of like a fact. the economy always has a direction. Deregulating the economy gives it a particular type of direction. When you cut capital gains tax, when you don't have a financial transaction tax, when we're taxing labor more than materials, that gets you a particular type of economy, right? So it's really about making much more explicit that conversation. What is the direction of this economy? And then once you admit that actually there's some really ambitious goals, like as I mentioned, the 17 SDGs, or let's just focus for a minute on the circular economy and a more sustainable kind of economy, the question is what's going to actually get us there? And so one of the things that I've been advocating, funnily enough, almost too successfully in the sense that I managed to somehow change the legal structure in Europe, at least in terms of its innovation instruments. I'd been advocating for some years that we needed a more mission-oriented kind of moonshot approach. I think the first conference I organized around this was back in 2013. And in the last couple of years, the European Commission asked me to write some reports and kind of put forth some policy around that. So the idea is, if you want a circular economy, what might be the kind of moonshots that we need to have as sort of a guiding light, right? And what is the role of government in that? And so I've prepared here. These are just the poster boards that I use for some of that work. Just let me explain to you. I feel very open university here.
This is great. This is a tutorial.
Right. I love it. You can just throw them across the room and get the next one. So the idea is that you begin with, the SDGs. So if you look at the clean oceans one, right? So life underwater. That's not going to get you very far if it remains kind of very vague. And, it's a very important challenge, but what does that actually mean for what we do, the kind of everyday? So the idea is you transform it into a very concrete mission, as concrete as going to the moon and back again in one generation was, right? And going to the moon and back required many different sectors. It wasn't just aeronautics. It required investment in innovation and nutrition and textiles and software and electronics, on and on. So that kind of, having a mission, for example, a plastic-free ocean, reduction of 90% of plastics entering the marine environment, and collection of more than half of plastics present in our oceans, seas, and coastal areas by 2025, that's much more concrete than just clean oceans. And then the idea is that you would use industrial policy, innovation policy, procurement policy to really galvanize as many different sectors as possible, not just one, to help you get there, right? As the moonshot did. So the chemical, social innovation, biotech, waste management, human health, marine, AI. But this bit here is, I think, the most difficult bit. So these are the projects. Now, you can't see this, so it doesn't really matter because I'm explaining it to you. These are different projects, right? So plastic and microplastic digestion mechanism, reusable and biodegradable plastic substitutes, autonomous ocean stations to remove plastic pollution, image recognition and deep learning waste separation system for domestic and marine waste, reuse of packing items through personalized collection services. These are just examples. You probably have 1,000 of these different projects, of which many will fail, right? So the willingness to actually engage with real kind of risk and uncertainty is key. As we know with the Apollo program, it often did fail, but the learning that occurred, the trial and error is one of the things actually that public institutions do least well, because they're not allowed to mess up, right? You get front page of the Daily Mail when a public actor fails in this whole accusation of picking winners. So moving away from that ideology of, is it the state, is it the private sector, who sets the direction? The point of the mission-oriented approach is that these kind of broad directions, which are the SDGs, the role of government then is to really steer the way by helping different types of actors in both the private and the third sector, for example, but also the public sphere, work together in new ways, create additionality, which means creating investments that wouldn't have happened anyway, but especially to transform the levers that government has through procurement policy, grants, loans, prize schemes, to really crowd in the bottom-up solutions to fulfill the mission itself. And so another one, this is the last one, don't worry. There's many different examples, but I won't bore you. So climate change, 100 carbon neutral cities in Europe by 2030. Again, this was all work for the European Commission. Lots of different sectors, those bottom-up projects. Obviously, how this lands in a particular country or in a city, will then determine the kind of the details. But this idea that somehow you can just have SME policy, for small companies, or kind of sector-specific industrial strategy, or innovation policy that is focusing on particular technologies, it's that I'm trying to move us away from. I'm saying focus on the problem. We got a lot of problems out there. Use those problems to focus the industrial strategy, the SME policy, the innovation policy, in order to really crowd in as many different solutions to get there. But that means having an outcomes orientation for policy itself, as opposed to just dispersing and, kind of giving out money to categories of firms, technologies, or sectors.
It's super helpful, and actually, I love the flip charts there with explainers. And I guess I get it. It's right. It's messy. It's not just down to government. It's about this private sector engagement. There's going to be high rates of failure. There needs to be patient investment capital that supports that and nurtures that. In those examples, though, it does seem like the very first step is someone setting the goal of 100, carbon neutral cities. And does the EU in that case have to take that first step for this to happen?
So what the EU has done, for example, in its recent Horizon 2020 policy, which again, this missions instrument, which now exists on the back of these reports, is trying to help make happen. They've chosen 5 mission areas. And, these have a lot to do with, clean growth, sustainable cities, soil and water. There's one around cancer, but these are very broad areas. They've then selected mission boards with some experts that then their task now is to actually select particular missions. Now, the problem is, first of all, many of the missions that we're talking about, first of all, are societal, they're social, they're deeply wicked, right? They have both political, economic, behavioral aspects to them. That's much, much harder than purely technological ones, like getting to the moon and back. It was actually easier to get to the moon than to solve inequality on Earth, right? And so citizen participation, I personally believe, is absolutely key. Now, that also opens up a huge box of possible, debate and controversy and lack of harmony, but that's itself a skill that governments need, empathy, how to listen to different voices, how to bring different voices to the table ex ante, not just ex post. And by the way, trade unions and kind of workers' voices, if we can put it simplistically like that, have really been missing from lots of these debates. And so there's concepts, for example, of the just transition, which you might have heard is a very important concept put forth by global trade unionists. And as important as that is, and basically what that is saying that when we move from a fossil fuel-based economy to a greener one, many jobs are going to go, sectors, there's going to be a whole process of creative destruction, which might hurt particular types of workers. So we need to be investing in the skills of those people so they're not left behind. So we need to make the transition just by putting the human, the person, at the center, making sure that they move along and are upskilled and are part of this important part of history. But that shouldn't just happen ex post, right? Those voices, for example, of trade unions or the green movement, the student movement, really need to be at the table ex ante to even define, what do we mean by a green city? What is the carbon neutral city? How do we want to live in a particular region, whether it's a city or the countryside, and then help create some level of consensus on what that then means for the particular missions that a particular area might have. But that bit, which let's just call it stakeholder and citizen engagement, is probably the most difficult bit. And I haven't yet met any kind of policy official or area that's kind of a complete expert in that process, but that is absolutely essential. But the other issue is conditionality. And I just want to raise this because I think COVID-19 really brings us to the fore. So this isn't about just saying, hey guys, let's all do this really great, ambitious program of, cleaning up our cities or our oceans. It's also about restructuring the very institutions or instruments and levers which create a relationship between different economic actors. So specifically, let's say you have a public bank. I'll give you an exact example. In Germany, they have a public bank called the KfW. When they, with their Energiewende mission, they started to think about how to transform some of the relationships that they had with the private sector. I'm talking about the government. And so when the steel sector asked for a bailout from the government, the KfW bank, which provided the loan, made that loan conditional on steel lowering its material content, right? And the way that the German steel industry did that was through investing in new processes, which allowed them to repurpose, reuse, and recycle throughout the whole value chain. And that basically made them one of the most innovative steel sectors in the world today, the most sustainable. That didn't happen because they woke up and went to Davos and said, oh, we need to put purpose at the center of our business strategy. We need to have stakeholder-driven approaches. It happened because they had to in order to access that loan. And if you think about the huge amounts of public funds in both energy, but also IT, the internet itself came out of government funding, health, where 75% of blockbuster drugs actually come about through public funding, like in the US through the National Institutes of Health. I think we need more conditionalities. Conditionalities in the case of health around, say, the prices and the logistics around the intellectual property rights. We need to have as much collective intelligence as possible, for example, when we're racing towards a vaccine. And if we don't govern that process in a way where public investments are conditional on actors really working as a team and having a more of a win-win kind of approach, then we fail to deliver on what could be a much more symbiotic, mutualistic kind of partnership and ecosystem. Because unfortunately, especially in areas like health, it hasn't been a lack of collaboration. There's just been a very problematic form of collaboration between public and private.
Yeah, and I love that those examples. It also seems just so intuitive, right? That we would attach, as you say, my layman's kind of non-economist brain goes that basically the T's and C's around any type of like bailout or investment the government makes to achieve the right outcomes for the country and for citizens and for the
but we haven't done that. So in the UK, EasyJet got a massive bailout, no strings attached, whereas Macron in France was very clear. He said, we're not here to save industry, we're here to transform it. So the bailout to both Renault and to Air France was conditional on carbon reduction.
Great. Yeah, and that's great. So that's what I was going to ask, because across the world, because of COVID, we have seen governments step into the economy in big ways. In the UK, that typically was post-financial crisis followed by a long period of just austerity and trying to pull out. So do you think that the reaction and the response to COVID-19 is more favorable for the kind of missions-oriented, government being a bit more of an entrepreneur and investor and driving these outcomes, or actually is it going to make it harder to push for agendas like that because they're just going to be focused on how do we pull out of the economy, how do we balance the books, how do we get our kind of investment back?
Right. Well, I think you've just raised some really critical points that we're actually living through right now. So first of all, when COVID-19 hit, just like when the financial crisis hit, governments did put in a lot of money. Over $2 trillion in the US and the UK, we've had this very active furlough scheme, as well as different types of investments, which just, some months before would have been seen as too extreme. The problem is how you structure those. So both with the financial crisis, it wasn't a lack of funds going in. It was that most of those funds just found their way back into the financial sector, right? So they didn't actually land on kind of real structures. And I think with COVID-19, the first thing to say, and I do think this is a really urgent point, is that, it's a health pandemic. So we need global health systems to be funded. You can have one really active, kind of well-funded health system, but if other ones aren't, then no one is safe. So in some ways, that's a huge wake-up call. We're only all as safe as our neighbor is. So you'd hope that a lot of this money going in was really kind of finding its way to strengthening, let's call it what it is, the welfare state and public health systems globally. And unfortunately, that's not happening. Many countries are not actually being ambitious around their health system. So once you have a second wave or a third wave, they're kind of back to square one. Having said that, there's lots of problems that aren't just health related that COVID-19 has thrown up. One I mentioned before, the digital divide. All these kids, I've got 4 of them, being schooled at home. My kids might have had great access to the internet, to broadband, to gadgets. We've got too many of them in the house. Many kids, even in London, let alone in developing countries, don't have access to that. So the kind of increase in inequality that come about if, again, we don't govern the system properly. And so I do think on the one hand, COVID-19 is throwing a lot of problems at us that are very open and amenable to this mission-oriented approach. The problem is if that's not your viewpoint of what the role of policy is, then that's going to be a lost opportunity. Hence why I've sort of been on a mission during COVID and the different task forces that I'm on in terms of let's get our hands dirty with the details of the structure of these recovery funds as opposed to just think that putting in a lot of public money is going to help. Secondly, though, because it is a lot of public money that's going in, unfortunately, we're already hearing, I hear this in the UK, the need to have, burden sharing, for example, with the local councils. I live here in Camden in London. Camden's done a lot for its citizens, from food banks to other types of activities. And that really should have just been seen as a massive, urgent wave of investment. And now the focus should be on building back better, not paying back that debt to central government, having to cut even further all the different, services that over the last 10 years we know have been cut, from mental health services to different types of, again, community resources, simply to balance the books. Balancing the books in the short run doesn't balance the books in the long run if you just create a huge mess that then you have to come in urgently later to fix up. So that kind of notion of long run budgeting and understanding that actually making our economy and our communities and people living in sound, resilient communities, and again, mental health or the planetary health are very important, obviously not just for us as societal members, but even for the economy. It actually might cost more now, but it costs less in the future by actually strengthening these structures that are so important to us all living with dignity. And unfortunately, that's not the view of many governments. And I do think that that's important. Otherwise, we're just going to get ourselves going from one crisis to another crisis if we just start cutting now and not really strengthening.
Yeah, and I guess personally, my outlook, and I guess Foundation's outlook, is to try and be realistic, but at the same time be optimistic.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to kind of avoid maybe some of the more challenging topics. So, for example, what's happening in the US at the moment, what's happening in the UK politically, it's very challenging. It sounds like actually what's happening in the European Commission is a bit of a bright spot, and there's some good stuff happening. You were involved in a whole bunch of conversations every day around this. And if you were to, put your bets behind what will be the first demonstrator of a kind of, not a moonshot or a missions innovation program coming to fruition and being felt by citizens, where would that be? What would that be? Are there any that are particularly advanced, or anything that you look at and you think, I think this one's got legs, this is going to do it?
Well, that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think I'd answer that on three different levels. One is the type of actors that I think have been more courageous and active on this front. And I would say that city mayors have. So I gave a talk just before going on holiday to 40 mayors through the C40 network around the power of a mission-oriented approach at the city level. And I remember one of the mayors of New Orleans, Mayor Cantrell, was talking about just how important having, a sustainable kind of carbon neutrality mission for a city is important to also interlink that, say, with what was going on with Black Lives Matter in New Orleans and, the inequality question just much more broadly. And I think cities, because they are, and city mayors are working with such concrete topics like how to go from point A to point B, or sewage systems, future mobility, that the kind of problems that they're dealing with are, again, very concrete, that you can form missions around, but making sure that they are missions that, again, bring as many different sectors to the table as possible and don't just become kind of one about refurbishing building materials, but actually, again, really have that kind of future of mobility aspect to it in that case. One of the examples that we worked with in the UK around future mobility, even just putting the word 100% accessible mobility system, meant that the kind of innovation that was required then bottom up, those blue circles I had before, also had to come from the community, from the disabled community. So all the different, again, investments and innovations that would make you think not just about ramps, but literally how do you access a well-structured public transport system from the point of view of people that are differently abled. So I do think, however, that, coming back to that citizen engagement point before, the documentary that David Attenborough made for us all as humanity, Blue Planet 2, and that those last episodes with all those fish and animals, choking on plastic, I think that woke up so many students and kind of kids. I mean, I see this in the schools, like that plastic-free ocean mission, I just think is a really interesting one to kind of see through with the international scale because it has a resonance with people. People get that. And, you know, you have countries also like Rwanda, who, you know, have been very ambitious around that. So when you land in Kigali, you're asked to just leave your plastic, including the duty-free bag, on the plane, right? But again, coming back to the role of culture, and, you know, Attenborough's film is just an example. I think the more we can bring different kind of cultural voices to the table to help people just kind of imagine what would it really look like to have, in that case, a plastic-free ocean, and then to, you know, set yourself time limits and kind of really concrete metrics. So globally, I do think that's a really interesting mission that I do see starting to have more ambition, and we're, I don't want to say we're getting there, but anyway, it's going
That's
forward.
particularly the ocean plastics.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, sorry, the ocean
issue.
plastics. Yeah. But I do think that this issue of health systems today, where it's not just about hospitals, but, you know, if we could make every single care home, but even pharmacy, think of all the pharmacies that exist, you know, in a country. They're currently just kind of these static places where you go in, you buy something, you walk out. The more you could actually have a really ambitious, decentralized public health system that would include care homes, hospitals, but also a public dialogue with entities like pharmacies that, again, put people's health and a much broader notion of their health around well-being and wellness at the center. And then you have, you know, a very concrete mission around the health of a nation with, again, broad definitions of what that means, a lot of that being preventative, of course, and that you'd sort of tap into all these different structures that currently are there, but they're not activated. Again, they're not part of this additionality scheme where, again, investments that wouldn't have happened anyway, a catalytic kind of energy around solving a particular problem. And I do think the more we as a nation, globally, different nations, but also regionally, can think about really ambitious health missions, broadly defined, you know, the more we will have used this health pandemic as an opportunity to change how we structure our economies. But, you know, just completely different. Again, I live in London. We have a huge knife crime epidemic amongst especially disadvantaged youth. Why not just say zero knife crime? You know, zero knife crime in London. I mean, that's what a mission is, zero. You don't say, oh, let's reduce crime. Zero knife crime amongst teenagers. What does that mean for the kind of investments you need then in social services and youth centers and mental health and education? You know, you could really start mapping out all the different types of investments that you would need across different actors, disciplines, and sectors, with the goal being zero, right? There's no reason that 13-year-old kids in school uniforms should be, you know, showing up in hospitals stabbed, you know, 5 to 7 times, which is, I'm just saying this very boldly, this is something that is absolutely tragic that's happened in the city in which I live. And one approach to that is just to think, okay, here's a bit of money for one actor, here's another, you know, bit of money for this community, as opposed to, again, just really saying this problem is massive and we're going to have a very concrete metric, which is zero. And let's bring, you know, different actors together to the table to think about what it's going to require to get us there. And so instead of giving money out to lots of different, you know, entities and then hoping for the best, the budget, it becomes an outcomes-based budget. You worry about the outcome and then you kind of structure the activities to get you there. And that's what a moonshot approach is.
Yeah, it's a really interesting example, that last one. I've also, I don't know if it was another city in the UK, but I've heard a response or an approach to tackling knife crime was to treat it like a public health, treat violence like a public health crisis. So it almost, violence is an infection that spreads, it's a virus. And if you take a public health response to that issue, you can get to quite a different place on it.
It actually gives me goosebumps. I actually get goosebumps when I think about these things, because it makes you believe again in the power, really, of policy for solving some of the greatest problems of our time. And yet, unfortunately, what we're seeing is not that. But I think I'm an optimist, and I think we can get there, but we have to redesign. It really is a design challenge.
Yeah, well, and that's completely aligned with how we talk about circular economy. And another thing I maybe just wanted to close on really is that even in my questioning, I'm being slightly reductionist. You know, I'm asking you for the example, the tangible thing that shows that this can work. But it's obvious that actually there's something a bit, is cultural, right? It's about shifting mindsets, and it's a bit more meta, actually, because we need many different things to change in the system to be able to have a missions-oriented, you know, innovation project. When we think about the audience, the people who are listening to this, professionals working in companies and cities and governments around the world, who are tuned in because they're intrigued by the circular economy topic. What would be your message to them? What's your kind of call to action or statement to those people who are maybe hearing circular economy for the first time, maybe hearing, your messages for the first time? What does an individual do? How does an individual start to participate in this?
I think it's useful to ask, what do we even mean by the individual, right? So, can you just sum up a lot of different individual actions and then hope that that kind of sum creates a massive change? Well, I can't think of any period in history where that happened. So it's always a mix between kind of a top-down setting of a really, ambitious agenda, and then bottom-up individual initiative within certain constraints and clear guidelines that are set. So coming back to that, a point about tax, which is just one of the ways that our constraints are structured. If we have a problematic tax system, which is rewarding short-termism and not long-termism, well, you're going to get certain kind of behaviors because the incentives have been created as such. Having said that, there's all sorts of individual creativity and entrepreneurship that, notwithstanding, the macro constraints, might be going in an opposite direction. But I think we need to go beyond thinking the individual versus just kind of big public policy, and always look at those interactions. And I do think, where I think the really radical agenda is to start asking, what does it mean to partner in a different way between individuals, between different types of actors like public, private, again, third sector and citizen groups, and actually have metrics for that, right? So even a lot of the language that we use, that the public side is de-risking the private side, that's already setting up the agenda in a particular way where you have a risk taker there and a de-risker there. Or actually, you kind of want them both to be taking risks, using their full imagination, creative potential, and again, foster that collective intelligence. I think that's the question of the future. How do we get individual, creativity and the design of policy to work together in such a way that really fosters as much collective intelligence and experimentation and trial and error to help us solve the biggest problems of our time, whether it's the plastic-free ocean or the zero knife crime in London. And of course, there's a huge amount of room, or there's a huge role for individuals. But unfortunately, if we put it that way, what is the role of the individual? It already sets us down that track that kind of becomes that dichotomy of the individual versus, the big, bold policy. So to have that redesign in policy that I'm talking about means putting the individual at the center, their life at the center, and thinking, what would a better life look like around actually having an outcomes orientation, the policy.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I guess one thing we see in the network is actually it's individuals just thinking about that balance between top down, bottom up. If you're working in a major company that's part of our network and committing on these topics, searching for and trying to find some of those top down pushes or buckets of energy that are coming. Or even if you live in a certain city now, if you're working for a big company committing to circular economy and you're living in Barcelona, that city will have initiatives, top down initiatives. So actually there is acting on some agency to try and find those threads or those kind of waves of energy and connect into them and participate in some way.
Yeah. But the other just quick thing I'd say is, coming back to the COVID-19 situation, if you're a company that's not willing to accept that a period as tragic as this one shouldn't be also full of, again, conditions attached, whether it's how you treat your workers, not excessively using share buybacks, reducing carbon, across your whole value chain, at least as a commitment in the next years, and you just expect kind of a public subsidy, I think that's part of the problem, and vice versa, right? You can have really kind of boring public actors who think they can just throw a lot of money into the system. So this notion of stakeholder capitalism, which was, again, very trendy word in Davos this year, we need to start walking that talk, and it can't just be about corporate governance. It's also about corporate relationships with different actors. Again, not just the state, even though I look a lot at state actors. And I think it'd be very useful if over the next year we start asking, what are the metrics? What are the ways that we would know in 6 months or 12 months that we're actually working together in a different way? So it's both about, circular economy across the whole value chain, but it's also circular economy in terms of how, different actors are literally relating to each other, and how that relationship itself and the progress of it, learning by doing, what works, what doesn't, is improved. because otherwise it just keeps being susceptible to having some myths about where the change is, but then the relationships, just like if you have a couple, it can be an abusive relationship or a really functional relationship. We need better measures of those relationships between economic actors that co-create value.
Mariana, thank you so much for taking the time out today. Good luck getting your feet back under the desk after your break. And we'll see you soon.
Great. Thank you very much. It was a pleasure.